Let's get started. So welcome everyone to Ag Forestry to Go. For those of you that I don't know, my name is Hannah Pausch and I'm the program director with Ag Forestry. We are so glad that you've joined us today, and we're excited to have a panel of all Ag Forestry alumni. I'm going to introduce them all to you in just a moment, but I want to cover a couple of housekeeping items. So as you've discovered, we set this up as a meeting, which means that you have the opportunity to unmute. We did that because we wanted you to have the most authentic opportunity to ask questions of our guests today. But we will ask that you keep yourself on mute as we move forward. And after each speaker, our moderator, Bruce Beckett, will open it up for questions. And of course, if you would prefer to have one of us ask your question, please submit it through the chat function. So we're going to try and run this like a webinar, but we wanted you to have that really authentic and in-person feel as much as we can do virtually. So without further ado, I do want to thank Senator Schessler, especially for joining us today, and we appreciate you participating in this panel. I am going to introduce you to our moderator and our panelists. Our moderator for today's session is Bruce Beckett. Bruce is a member of Ag Forestry Class 16. He is a principal at the Beckett Group from Gig Harbor, and he is a contract lobbyist specializing in labor, natural resources, aviation, and environmental issues and legislation. Bruce comes from a forestry background. He represented Weyerhaeuser Company for nearly 2 decades. And before forming his own practice, he was part of forming the Washington Hospitality Association, which is based in Olympia. Thank you, Bruce, for volunteering to moderate today's session. And our panelists today, we have 3 speakers with us today. Senator Mark Schessler, Class 10 of Ag Forestry, represents the 9th Legislative District. He was elected to the House of Representatives in 1993, where he served for 12 years before being elected to the Washington State Senate. Senator Schessler served as the Republican leader for the last 8 years and recently announced that he'll step away from that role to spend more time with his family on his farm, which it sounds like that's where you're joining us from today, 5th generation dryland wheat farm in the family since the 1880s. So thank you for being with us, Senator.
Good to be here.
We also have Heather Hansen on the call today. Heather was a member of Class 17. She has her own government relations firm and specializes in agricultural and natural resource issues. Her clients include the Washington Friends of Farms and Forests, Washington Farm Forestry Association, the Washington State Grange, Washington Nursery and Landscape Association, and the Washington State Fairs Association. Heather earned both of her bachelor's and master's degrees at WSU, and she currently serves on the advisory board of the Ruckelshaus Center for Public Policy. Heather has received awards for grassroots organizing, promoting agriculture and excellence in legislative and government affairs from various state and national organizations. And last, but certainly not least, we have Matt Comiskey from Class 31 joining us today. Matt is a Seattle native, and from an early age, he enjoyed camping, hiking, and exploring in the woods. This passion led him to obtain his bachelor's in forest engineering from the University of Washington. He spent 15 years in private industry, providing engineering, forestry, construction management, and real estate services to both large and small private landowners. And he also has worked as an engineer with DNR. Today, he's the Washington State Manager for the American Forest Resource Council, where he's responsible for monitoring both state and federal timber programs. He works with various stakeholders on policy issues throughout the state. Thank you all for being here, and I hope that you all please help me welcome our guests with your warmest virtual applause. And with that, I will pass it over to Bruce Beckett.
Okay, thank you, Hannah, and thank you everyone for being here. Just a couple of housekeeping things. I'm going to try to control this in the sense of 15 minutes per segment. And so, you know, I don't know how long the speakers will go on, but if there's time at the end of, say, 15 minutes per segment, we'll open it up for questions verbally. Or Hannah, if you can monitor the chat box, if people put questions in the chat box, we can try to handle it that way as well. And then I'll make sure we move on so that everybody gets the equal time in terms of the agriculture and forestry segments. But let's first start with Senator Mark Schessler. Senator Schessler, when we set this forum up, was before that you had announced that you were going to step down as leader. And I'd be remiss if we just simply didn't thank you for your years of service as the leader, the remarkable outcomes dealing with the Supreme Court decision on K through 12 funding probably would not have happened without your leadership. And so you've been an inspiration for many ag forestry classes and people that have been through the program of how important it is to get involved. So I guess at the outset, I just want to personally thank you for the years that you've been in the leadership role in both the House and the Senate, and know that this organization respects that immensely.
Thank you for your kind words.
And I got to know you an awfully long time ago, so I appreciate you being on here. Let's first start with the fact that the Ag Forestry Program works to train people and prepare them for working in the public policy environment and public engagement. Can you provide any advice and guidance, as everybody on this call wants to engage with the legislature this year, of how it's going to function in a virtual environment and how people can engage?
Well, I think we're really in uncharted waters, to say the least. But I think this is the time that the real grassroots contact will be more important than ever. Because in the past, I'd come speak to an ag forestry class, go to a reception, we'd chat. The groups that you are almost all members of have a lobby day, you interact in person. The possibility of interactions in person are just about zero. So this goes back to the old-fashioned grassroots. Write a real email, not one of these darn form letters or spams, but an honest to God real email. Use a telephone and connect with people. Sooner the better, because I think that open government is going to be compromised and the public is going to be shut out in light of special interests that favor current majority. So if you think that click here is going to do it, or such things, you're probably mistaken. It's got to be real contact. People that made a connection to their legislators in the last 9 months, not the upcoming 9 months. And that honest to God, real communication through direct means rather than secondary.
So from your understanding, will the legislative buildings, the Capitol building, and all be closed to public access?
Completely and totally. The House is going to be so virtual that only the floor leaders and the presiding officer are on the floor. I'm not sure if members can be in their office or just the legislative aide or both. I can be in my office. I can have my longtime legislative aide, but no session aide. Approximately half of the senators will be allowed on the floor, but we're not going to have our staff in the wings to get to right now. So, and every building will be closed. The Ledge building, the O'Brien, the Sherberg library, all locked down. And that's what's going to make it more of a challenge. The hybrid of the Senate and the total virtual of the House will make this more challenging than ever.
So in light of all that, Senator, what are the big issues and how do you think they're going to move along this session that you as still a leader in the state Senate see coming our way?
Well, I think the climate change locomotive is coming down the tracks, and it's not necessarily in the best interest of rural Washington, may or may not be manageable by natural resource industries. I think there's a huge demand for new programs on top of new programs, when normally we'd just be grateful that we realized a few weeks ago there is no deficit.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to open it up for questions, Hannah, if there's any in the chat box, or does anybody else, would anybody else like to weigh in with Senator Schessler before we move on?
If I could, I would like to.
Please.
Is it okay to do it verbally?
Yeah.
Senator, this is Sarah Higgins with the Washington Wine Growers Association and the Columbia Basin Development League. And one of the questions I had for you, as we do try to engage with our legislators in this unique environment this year, I know you are urging the grassroots effort and communications early, but in terms of opportunities to connect in a similar fashion as maybe visits in Olympia would have been, are our legislators open to, virtual Zoom meetings, the short little meetings? Can we do things during session, like scheduling through your offices for those types of interactions?
I think it's a case-by-case basis, Sarah. I've already had a few inquiries from associations wanting to do a 15-minute virtual meeting. And I think I'm going to have more time to do those than I used to. So that'll happen. I know one chair in the Senate who's already denied video meetings with different organizations. Did a meeting with Washington Retail just yesterday, and they said, well, we're not going to be allowed to meet with this chair. So it's a case-by-case basis. It's a very good strategy, but it'll be member by member, case by case. And one thing that my House member, Joe Schmick, who's an ag forestry alum, has said, since there's no dinners or receptions, doing it in the evening is not off base. Before, evenings were, we had a reception, we had a dinner, and some nights we had multiples. Now I don't have a whole lot of dinner options. There's no receptions. I too would probably be as much or more available from 6 o'clock to say 8 than I've ever been.
Thank you, Senator.
So before we move on to the agricultural segment, Heather, get ready. Senator Schessler, do you have any, final words? And then of course, you're certainly welcome, and I think people would love it if you'd stick around, but do you have any final thoughts?
I think this is the time to be the great communicators, because we can't do it in person. We don't necessarily belong to organizations with unlimited resources. So, people called Reagan the great communicator. And I think within agriculture and natural resources, we need to be the great communicator. I'm going to stick around because I want to hear what the other panelists have to say before I have to jump off for another meeting this afternoon.
Okay. Well,
We
then
actually
why
have
don't
a
we move? Go
question.
ahead.
Sorry, Bruce. We've got a question in the chat box for Senator Schessler. Senator, would you be able to give us a little more detail on your comment about the no deficit?
Sure. In June, we were probably in one of the worst situations in 3 decades. And a special session like Oregon and Idaho would have been in order to get our financial house in order. Unexpectedly to anyone, the September revenue forecast was quite good. The end of November forecast was quite good. And the caseload forecast indicated much lower costs in November. So with that, there is no deficit in the remainder of the 1921 biennium, which sets us up for a relatively easy budget in 21-23 if you stick to current law spending levels. If you abandon current law spending levels with large new agendas, you have a problem. But we have currently enough money, and we have a large enough amount of money in the budget stabilization account that we could work on digging out of the economic quagmire some industries are in, and legitimate unexpected expenses like forest fires that would free up general fund money for 21-23.
Thank you. Okay, Heather, the agricultural sector is extraordinarily diverse. And I think it's probably unfair to ask one person to touch on the ag issues going into this session, but that's what we've asked you to do. So take it away and describe to us some of the things that you and your colleagues are going to be focused on this session. Thank you.
Okay, and I'm sure that we have people listening that have other priorities and other issues that are important to them. And I love questions and love hearing from people, because this is very much a two-way street, and knowing what people are thinking about and concerned about across the state is very important. So I'll start with perhaps the most interesting thing from an ag lobbyist perspective is that we have a new committee chair. For a long time, I think almost close to 20 years, Representative Brian Blake chaired the Ag and Natural Resources Committee. He lost his seat in November's election. The new committee chair was just named. It will be Mike Chapman from Port Angeles. I will say that Representative Chapman is probably the most conservative member of the House Democratic Caucus. He's, represents Port Angeles and, Clallam County. He's a former Clallam County commissioner. He does understand timber and small farming and rural, just the realities of life living in a rural area. He is who we were hoping for as chair of this committee, and we're very, very glad that he was named. Anytime you have any change in leadership, a new committee chair, there are always some unknowns. You're not sure exactly how the dynamics will work out. In this case, of course, we also have a new Speaker of the House, Lori Jenkins, and the dynamic between the Speaker and the committee chairs is still a little bit of an unknown. Speaker Chop gave his committee chairs quite a bit of freedom and did not interfere with their decisions. We hope that Speaker Jenkins is the same or similar. That gives the chair a fair amount of control over the agenda within the committee, which means if a bad bill gets referred to that committee, the chair generally has the ability to stop it or prevent it from being heard, which can be a very, very powerful way to stop bad legislation. Of course, it's not foolproof, and there's always the strategy of referring bills to different committees, but we are optimistic with Representative Chapman as chair. Okay, issues. I think I can say without a doubt the issue that agriculture as a whole is most concerned about right now is a recent court decision over agricultural overtime. That decision would require any agricultural worker who works more than 40 hours a week to get paid time and a half. That puts us at a significant disadvantage to every other state. There are 3 other states that now have some form of ag overtime: Maryland, New York, and California. But it's just being phased in. We don't yet really know how it's going to work there. And none of theirs are as stringent as ours. They kick in at 60 hours a week, where ours kicks in at 40 hours a week. They have other exemptions. So the biggest concern, well, obviously, concerned about how much it will cost going forward, but the biggest concern is that the way the decision was written leaves the door open for retroactive pay, a 3-year look back, and there's a very real potential that agricultural employers could be required to pay overtime for any time over 40 hours a week for the past 3 years. That could break a lot of people. So legislative staff is looking at ways to deal with this. More lawsuits are being filed. The lawsuit that was decided technically applied only to dairy, but on December 10th, a new lawsuit was filed in Yakima Superior Court, looking at the 3-year back wages. I think there's another lawsuit in the process that would expand it to all agricultural workers rather than just dairy. And so we're collectively trying to figure out if it makes more sense to ask the legislature for help now or wait until the rest of the lawsuits are settled. Normally, legislators like to wait until the courts have completed their work. And under any other circumstances, we'd probably say, let's wait and see what the courts do. But under these circumstances, with the decision that we have, I think that we're leaning towards it makes more sense to ask the legislature now to step in, because these employers followed the law as written. And to ask them to pay back wages for 3 years could just be devastating. That's still very much in flux, trying to figure out a path forward as more lawsuits get filed all the time. Jump to another topic, pesticide fees. This might not be as big an issue for as many people, but I know it is important to a lot too. Department of Agriculture has an agency request bill that would increase both pesticide registration fees and pesticide license fees, both by about 30%, so it's a significant increase. The license fees, that could be especially onerous for companies that pay for license fees for their employees. Example, if you're a farm that has a number of licensed applicators and the farm is paying all of their license fees, or a lawn and tree care company or another type of company that is paying license fees, that's going to add up. The money that they're hoping to generate from this fee increase would be used to create a new technical assistance program within the Department of Agriculture pesticide program, and more education, expanding their education program so they could help growers specifically with air blast type sprayers, doing more training for farm workers and more training for air blast sprayer operators to ensure that those pieces of equipment are properly adjusted and not spraying above the canopy to minimize drift. Drift has been a big political issue the last several years, as has the potential for farm worker exposure. And so Department of Ag is hoping that by expanding technical assistance and education programs, we can get ahead of that. And then I'll jump to the third topic, which Senator Schessler mentioned, and I'm sure you're all aware of, kind of the combination carbon tax, low carbon fuel standard, carbon, et cetera, all things. There will be a bunch of bills. The governor's ideas were just rolled out. He'll have his path. From the northwest corner of the state, Representative Sharon Shoemake and Representative Deborah Lacanoff and Senator Liz Lovelet are working together. They're also working with Carbon on a bill that would create green bonds. Was on a call with Representative Shoemake this morning talking about this, and it was interesting to me the things that she emphasized. That so their plan is to put a price on carbon and then sell bonds. And because it's a bond bill, it does not require, they have it structured so it does not require a 2/3 vote like a tax bill would. She made a point of that. I think clearly that's part of their strategy to not have to pass something with a 2/3 vote. She's very aware that it would increase the cost of fuel, and dyed diesel would be exempt. But of course, we all know dyed diesel, is just used in farm implements in the field. It does nothing for driving, your pickup from home to the field, or a truck from the field to the packing shed, or from the packing shed to the market. And she is very much aware that that's an issue and that's a huge concern for agriculture. And she said, that's too hard to figure out. And so there's no way around it. It just is what it is. She did later in the conversation say that perhaps there'd be a way to have a rebate for other fuel, transportation fuel used in agriculture. She also mentioned that she hopes soon we'll have electric trucks, that maybe in a few years there won't be any diesel trucks, they'll all be electric trucks. So that was an enlightening conversation. And that bill will be introduced, because there are both House members and Senate members working on it, presumably it will be introduced on both sides. And that's interesting because I'll get to that in a minute about what House leadership has said about introducing bills. They don't want companion bills on both sides. So who knows? A couple of other things that Representative Shoemake mentioned that might be interesting is she's heard concern about solar facilities being located on prime farmland. And so she's going to run a bill. She did not get into specifics, but that deals with FSEC, the energy facility siting entity, and how they make decisions, and would like to find a way to limit solar facilities on prime farmland. She's also looking at a bill that would facilitate small meat processing. That issue's been around for a couple of years and is very important to her district. And this year with COVID, more and more people are wanting to buy food close to home. And so that became even more a factor
So,
for her.
Heather, why don't we open it up for a couple of questions? There's one in the chat box from Dave Roselip. Greetings, Dave. Who is advocating for the agricultural overtime issue? Is it all sectors of the agricultural community? Is it being led by, a particular entity or another?
So right now, so the Dairy Federation is in the lead because the lawsuit was against a dairy. And technically at this time, that decision only applies to dairies, although everybody believes it's just a matter of time before it's expanded to all agriculture. Washington State Farm Bureau also intervened in the lawsuit, so they're actively involved. And then of course, tree fruit will be affected more than anybody else because they have more labor than anybody else. So they are watching too, and looking at other strategies, but Dairy Federation is in the lead right now.
Okay. Are there any other questions that people want to voice to Heather before we move on?
Heather?
Go ahead.
Yes, Dave Roselip here. I was wondering who is on the other side of that issue? The over,
Yeah, I believe there are a number of groups that advocate for farm labor. I believe it was Columbia Legal Services.
so
Okay.
therefore they're the ones filing the lawsuits.
Yes, yes.
Well, let's move on to the forest product sector. And before we do so, Senator Schessler, are you still listening in? He's on the line, but okay, let's move
Right,
on to
I'm still there.
okay, yeah, there's a question that came in about, what do you think the chances are of the legislature overriding the governor's closures of small businesses around the state?
I got to be pretty pessimistic, to be honest with you, because to date, the other side of the aisle has publicly been in lockstep with the governor. Now, privately, they will admit there's some flaws, but publicly, there's been pretty intense party loyalty.
Yeah, I would agree with you, having been in the middle of some of this. Okay, Matt Comiskey, you're up. I'm going to pose a first thing for you is because I come from this sector and at least I think I know something about it. You might describe the roles of your organization, the Washington Forest Protection Association, and the organization that Heather represents, the Farm Forestry Association, before we get jumping into the issues.
Hey, I'd be happy to, Bruce. Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. So the organization I work for is American Forest Resource Council. Our primary membership are the manufacturers of lumber, plywood, mass timber, those type of things. And our focus of AFRC is on public timber. So we operate in 5 Western states, where primarily we look at Forest Service. In Oregon, the Bureau of Land Management. But in Washington, we also add in the Department of Natural Resources timber sale program. So really heavily focused on public lands and primary memberships, the manufacturing sector that purchases logs and timber sales. WFPA, Washington Forest Protection Association, has been around for well over 100 years now. Their primary focus are private lands, predominantly large industrial ownerships, and they really focus on a lot of the traditional private forest land issues around forest practices, some of the taxing, those type of things. And then Washington Farm Forestry Association that Heather works with, they represent the small private forest landowners around the state. I would note probably the largest land ownership group. But all 3 groups try to work as close together, realizing that most of our issues in many ways overlap, but we do have, some of our own individual sandbox issues that we try to, agree to deal with those on our own issues. So Bruce, hopefully that helps.
Yeah, and so Matt, the obvious question I'll pose to you is, on the heels of this wildfire season, the Lands Commissioner has come out saying we're going to double down on our efforts on wildfire and forest health. So describe a little bit about what you think that means and what's going on at this moment, and how you think this frames up. And Heather, you're more than welcome to jump in as well, because the small landowners, or anybody else on this call for that matter. But go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've had Washington State's experienced record fire seasons on and off over the last, decade. But I think the Labor Day fires, particularly down in Oregon, though I would remind folks that we did have a 22,000 acre timber fire in Western Washington on the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. But I think those fires really kind of opened a lot of people's eyes to the needs of needing to accelerate the work that the Department of Natural Resources, the Forest Service, private landowners have been undertaking for years. Some of that at the direction of the legislature, some of that out of just pure recognition that we need to do something. And I think many folks on this call probably are aware that there's been a few discussions on how to fund some of that work in the past, including a couple failed attempts of getting the insurance industry to help fund that, as well as, some pretty significant, though, financial commitments from the legislature to fund that work. But so where we find ourselves going into this session is Commissioner Franz pushing heavily to accelerate the state's 20-year forest health strategic plan, the wildfire strategic plan, and that all ties into this forest action plan. And I'm an engineer by trade, so I'll try not to get down in the weeds and tell you how to, put all the bolts and screws together. But really where that's ended up is Washington Forest Protection Association and AFRC have been working together very closely to help provide some input and guidance to proposed forest health legislation that I think the department has been sharing with a number of stakeholders. And we've been trying to force getting some additional input from farm forestry onto the issues because, I know just enough of their issues to be dangerous. So I try to reach out to Elaine and Heather to get input. But I think what we'll see very soon is a pretty substantial forest health and wildfire package going to the legislature. On the wildfire side, that'll be preparedness and prevention, not suppression, but looking to try to really accelerate the scope and the scale of work getting done on the ground. So far, both associations I would characterize as being agnostic on how it's funded. The legislature has to figure out how to put all the different pennies together to fund all this stuff. But I think you'll see, it's a pretty comprehensive package around, preparedness, which is aerial resources, fire engines, hiring the staff up until the fire bell rings. Forest health, a lot of that's going to be focused on federal lands, with a good portion of it also on state and private. And then I think you'll also see some workforce development issues and trying to address some of the issues, particularly, I think going into this session, the real dialogue to me is going to be more about how we assure that rural Washington benefits from a lot of the things that urban Washington has benefited from over the last couple of years.
So Matt, I'll add a bit of commentary. A lot of these activities could be done and not only pay for themselves, but also pay a little bit of money into the trust. So how do you see that debate shaping out in terms of, like you say, the industry has been agnostic and actually, a little bit about indifference, if you will, towards the need for additional funds. Where's AFRC beginning to move in that direction?
Well, I mean, I think the one thing, particularly when it comes from, doing commercial type work, especially on federal and state lands, it's AFRC's members that essentially are funding that work by buying logs off of those commercial projects. So I think that's where, there's one great opportunity from all of this is not only can we address forest health issues, we can address carbon issues, because if we're not burning the stuff up, we're not putting the carbon up into the atmosphere. And two, we can address the jobs and economic resiliency of many rural, Washington communities by generating log volume and all the other work that goes along with that, by bringing that into the mills and manufacturing it. And then, the cool thing is recognized in a bill 2528 that got signed into law last session, recognizing the good work that the forest product sector does on carbon in the state of Washington, both sequestration of standing trees and storage in finished wood products. So it's really kind of a good full circle opportunity. And, I think the industry is one of the tools that just through the commercial economic activity helps benefit some of the costs associated with doing this work.
So Matt, I'm going to switch topics a little bit because I know that you can answer this. There's now beginning to circulate from the DNR a multi-year project outcome called the Trust Land Performance Assessment. that was attempting to look at the financial performance of DNR trust lands. What observations do you have that's emerging from that discussion that's beginning to emerge?
I think it's, so far the various stakeholders, whether the beneficiaries, the state trust lands, the purchasing community, the environmental community, we've really only seen an overview presentation from some of those early discussions and the overview presentation that started to come to the board and various stakeholders at the beginning of December here. There's some real positive opportunities of, I really don't like the term modernizing, but I guess you'd say updating the business practices of the department when it comes to trust land management. I'd say there's also some real concerns amongst some of the beneficiary and purchasing community about some of the quote recommendations that have been put forward. One of those, for example, would require a constitutional amendment that I'm not sure. There's a very small group I'm finding that actually knows what it takes to get a constitutional amendment completed here in the state of Washington. So I think there's more to come. There'll be a few proposals brought to the legislature this session that come out of that trust land performance. They're fairly minor. The purchasing community's given feedback on many of those already. But from what I've been told, the big ones, certain key legislators have already told DNR, you need to make sure you're spending time over the next year working on those and refining those and working with your stakeholder groups because they're too big in this type of a session to tackle.
So Matt, or excuse me, Heather, I'm going to switch over to you for a moment because the third part of the triage, if you will, on the forest health and wildfire is the small forest landowners. Is your client in the middle of all this as well?
I'm not entirely sure how to answer that because we certainly should be. DNR has not reached out to us nearly as much as to other landowners, which is a concern. And we also have some concerns about the way some of the reports that fed into this were done. So
Okay.
not quite sure that it's really going to address small forest landowner needs as well as we wish it would.
Okay. So Matt, before we turn to questions and observations, do you have anything else you want to add about the forest products industry's work with the legislature both this year and last year?
Boy, other than, I think, as been mentioned, I think it's going to be a new world for all of us. Though I will say that I think in general, forest products sector has been working pretty good to try to make sure that we're all together and, rowing together in the same direction. I think the House Bill 2528 last session was a good indication of how, WFPA and AFRC particularly consciously came together and put forward a one industry message. And I think that you'll see that play out going into this coming session. But it's going to be a challenge because I think has been mentioned earlier are those touch points. A lot of the stuff that those of us that run around the Capitol during the session is, a lot of your work you get done is by catching legislators or their staff in the hallways in between committee meetings, and we're not going to have that opportunity this session. So the industry's here. We're going to work together. We're going to, row in the same way. I think climate and carbons are going to be a big thing. We view ourselves as an integral part of the solution. And so I think we're going to be working hard to navigate this interesting world to make sure that we're getting our positions, our views, and our issues out there in front of, not only the general public, but the legislature.
So as a moderator, I'm going to take a little bit of license here. And if Senator Schessler has been able to listen in on any of this, Just curious about any reaction or observations you might have to what you've heard from Matt or Heather.
Wow. Well, I've kind of been on a little bit of the other side of the issue. When you consider the whole issue of using property and casualty taxes
Yep.
to fund it, that's people like me that pay into a fire district. People that may support those people. And it penalizes the remaining in-state carriers in Washington, which I can tell you I'd rather do business with them than the national. The other thing that was interesting this summer, all of the really big fires that burned down 2 communities in my district, wiped out 2 ranches my son leases, were caused by electrical transmission lines. And it's clear the future of our state is going to be more electric, no argument whatsoever. That as we look at, it's not just forest health and fire prevention, it's how do we prevent these power line issues that happened in Lincoln and Whitman County and generated huge fires.
Senator, I guess I'll point out that at least Matt's organization never endorsed any funding mechanism the last couple of years. So I'm glad you brought that up, because some of this can be paid for if done in the way you set up the operations. There's a
Well, I
question
think
here.
there's one thing you should consider. My successor as leader, Senator Braun,
Yep.
proposed a bonding package that instead of dribbling this out over the next 10 or 20 years, if we're really serious about forest health for fire prevention, carbon,
Yep.
an upfront move makes quite a bit of sense. Unfortunately, didn't go anywhere, but I think that's an option if we really want to get this thing done for all the right reasons. We put forward an option that is a serious possibility.
Matt, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've kind of looked at, Senator Braun's bonding bill. There were a lot of things that I think we liked about that. AFRC basically is taking the position that funding of this work is really outside of our wheelhouse. That's not our area of expertise. Of course, we and our members have opinions on that. Where we've really felt like we provided value was inputting into the actual work that needs to be done, the policies and processes that go into getting that work done. But I think Braun's concepts do have a lot of value and need a lot more digging into it. And I'm pretty confident that AFRC will be having conversations. He happens to also be the senator from the community that I live in. So, there's a little bit of local constituency interest as well. But yeah, the funding question is not an easy one. And I think that's where a lot of the conversations are going to really have to dig into, is to make sure that we fund this in a productive way that gets the work done, but we don't have unintentional consequences of harming entities that, are actually there helping support the existing programs, such as, fire districts, those type of things.
So there's a question in the chat box since you came back online, Senator Schessler, from Tammy Perot. If I misstated that, I apologize. That she heard in a conference last week the discussion about the blue-red divide in Washington State, the urban-rural. Any ideas about how to bridge that urban-rural divide? It is also true that the Democratic caucus, lost some voices of reason or moderation with the loss of Representative Blake and Senator Tacko. So what's your, advice about bridging that divide?
Well, I don't think we can deny that it's real.
Yeah.
And I think one of the lessons I got from one of my ag forestry classmates was that we would be messaging and selling in perpetuity. We tend to think of, oh, if we just do it for 6 months or a couple of years, the problem will go away. We will be merchandising our issues in perpetuity, or we're fooling ourselves. I think this type of session, unfortunately, is the worst possible antidote for it, because over the years, I remember myself and members walking back and forth across the chamber, the House and Senate, pitching ideas at each other and getting together socially. If you can imagine, I worked on deals with Jim Hargrove, for example, off campus over dinner, late Kip Takuda and Mark Domit and I would go have dinner together. This entire situation is really set up to only make it worse. So our communication efforts have to be even stronger.
Okay, thank you. Hannah, are there other questions in the chat box, or anybody want to raise a question to any of the panelists verbally? There's a couple of minutes left.
We've got a question. Oh, it sounds like somebody was going to say something.
I was going to jump in and add on a little bit here. I'd rather go to questions, but I'll just really quickly say, I think one of the most important things that we can do outside of session, because I absolutely agree 100% with Senator Schessler's comments. Outside of session, the ag groups are working together to try to have a tour. We're hoping, we've done it the last few years, we're hoping we can do it again next summer. Get urban legislators out in rural areas, get them on farms, and try to help them have a better understanding of real issues in rural Washington. And I think for everybody on this call, any opportunity you get to interact with an urban legislator and help them understand more about rural Washington, take it. It is so important.
Hannah, is there
Thank you,
anything in the
Heather.
chat?
Yeah, Bruce, we have a question in the chat from Ken Miller. So Ken says, it seems like natural resource industries and agencies seem to get shorted on budgets relative to other states. Is that accurate? And why is that in such an environmentally conscious citizenry in Washington? I think it's for all the panelists.
You know, I think we've pretty well done it on our own. If you look, the Department of Agriculture is primarily user fees. If you wiped out the general fund portion of that budget, it would operate for hours or days. If you look at Department of Natural Resources, it operates from the resource management account. And Fish and Wildlife for decades pretty much got by on license fees, tags, permits. The challenges of today have moved beyond that. So we kind of got used to taking care of ourselves and not going in and asking for a whole lot. So it's a different era when you bring natural resources, global trade, climate change in, that those user fees really don't make it anymore.
There is a question in here, and Matt, I'll direct it at you. The question is with the horrific wildfires the last few years, do you think there's more acceptance by the environmental community for forest management?
I guess I would say it depends. You know, everything is, you know, people often think because I'm an engineer, I see the world as black and white. No, it's a lot of shades of gray. You know, there's a spectrum of perspectives in every community, as you can imagine. I would say that we have, you know, folks that I work with in the environmental community, particularly on federal lands, on, you know, I sit on several forest collaboratives. that are very pro-management. We may disagree about the level of management, but I would say it's pro-management. But then we do see projects that are litigated. Typically these days in Washington state, projects are usually litigated by environmental groups from outside of the state of Washington. And we have AFRC is unique in that we do have 2 on-staff attorneys in our organization, and we have defended Forest Service projects in which the Forest Collaborative or various members of the collaborative, including environmental groups, have essentially been, our clients in defending forest management projects on the Forest Service. So, but like I said, it depends, but I'd say in general, there's more acceptance. The debate these days, in fact, my email's been going off the walls because we're having a debate right now in one of the landscapes about what is the scale of treatment. Not a debate of treat or not treat, it's the scale of treatment. So that's where I really see kind of that discussion point has come down to, at least in Washington.
So Hannah, we're right up at 1 o'clock. I'll turn it back to you to close and ask for any feedback.
Yes, thank you all for being here. This is the close of our legislative preview, and it's also the close of our 2020 year of webinars. The first 2020 was a year of firsts for all of us, and for Ag Forestry, it was our first jump into virtual programming, both with the class and with the network. So we appreciate all of you being here with us and attending the various webinars. And thank you especially to our panelists and to Bruce today for walking us through this preview. So with that, I know everybody probably has to hop on to their next one. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Schessler, very, very much.
Well, thank
Yes.
you, all Ag Forestry alums.
Hear, hear.